Good evening, brethren.
Good evening.
Dedicated to the Holy Saints John. We say that a lot. We repeat it. It's part of our teachings. But what does it mean? John the Baptist, John of the Apocalypse. It does not mean that we just have their picture on a wall somewhere and we look at them and then that's it. It means that they both have a specific message that we as Freemasons, particularly in America, particularly now, must pay attention to. John of the Apocalypse. Now, if you look at the current times in which we live, they're pretty apocalyptic. And the reason that everyone thinks it's the apocalypse is because the year 2000 has come. Wacky, crazy things are happening in the Middle East. And Freemasonry somehow seems to be tied up in all this in the minds of the conspiratorially oriented. Now, John the Baptist, what was his function? Who was he? He came out of the wilderness with a fiery message for the complacent and asleep at the wheel authorities of his day. He said, look, these are the times that the prophets have talked about. What are you going to do about it? How dedicated are you? And that, my brothers, is the question I ask to you. How dedicated are you? Because Freemasonry now is at a crucial point in its history, and we cannot be asleep at the wheel. Conspiracy theorists are on the rise in a phenomenal way, driven by the internet, driven by our apocalyptic times, and almost all of them are focused on Freemasonry sooner or later in one form, greater or small. And what are we going to do about it? You know, I've talked to brethren all over the world about this. And I get the same canned answer almost every time. Well, those conspiracy theorists, they're going to believe whatever they want, and we got really nothing to do about it. We don't have anything to say. We're just going to have a dinner party. You think John the Baptist would take that as an answer? He'd throw you in the river. Because it's time to act. We cannot be just allowing our enemies to define us. We cannot be allowing the message and the whole point of our institution to be hijacked. The way jihadists have hijacked Islam, we cannot allow conspiracy theorists to hijack our institution. Right now, there are more people in the world aware and interested in Freemasonry than ever before. The problem is, it's 90% negative, if not 95% negative. Why? Because the conspiracy theorists are doing their job, and we, my brothers, are not doing our job. We're asleep at the wheel. And deadly consequences can result. You don't believe me? 10 years ago, guys who were at the top of Masonic society in Europe, Switzerland, France, these guys who are millionaires, dudes with $50 million a year going into their bank account. You know what they did 10 years ago? They got dressed up in Knights Templar regalia. They said Masonic and quasi-Masonic rituals. Then they shot themselves in the head, and they burned themselves to death because they believed that by executing this grand plan, which they perceived to be the fulfillment of Freemasonry's master plan, that they were going to be reincarnated on the planet Sirius as all-powerful beings. That sounds crazy. What does it have to do with Freemasonry, you ask? Well, my brethren, if you don't know what it has to do with Freemasonry, then you're asleep at the wheel. I'm sorry to tell you. I have to be a little bit like John the Baptist here. Because who were the members of this group known as the Order of the Solar Temple? They were top Freemasons and top guys from Freemasonry circles all throughout Central Europe. These were not some cracked out kooks in some shack. These guys were richer than all of you put together. These guys were at the top of society, but they believed in Freemasonry at a time when only its enemies and only the cultists were willing to define it in Europe. And so, in the early 80s, a couple of guys come along who've studied up on the Freemasonry history, studied up on the Knights Templar connections, looked at the calendar of light, 6,000-year plan, the calendar of light. How many people even know where it comes from or what it's about? Most guys in Europe didn't know, but the Solar Temple cultists told them that they knew. We've got the answer. This is what it all adds up to. So give us all your money, burn yourself to death in the fire, and it's all good. Now that, my friends, is one cautionary tale of what happens. And why it happened is because no one had a better answer. No one on the scene in Switzerland in 1985 to 1995 who was in a position to do anything even was aware of what was going on. People do not know. And because they don't know, people who are pretending to know can unleash devastating consequences. And now, let's look closely here about what exactly is going on. How could they possibly believe this, for example? It all comes down to the calendar of light, which is the calendar that we as Freemasons use, but as I said, no one really has much of an idea of even where it comes from, what's the origin. Well, there's a theory floated by Victorian Freemasons in the 1800s that the calendar of light that we use is actually a timeline with God's master plan for humanity, and that it correlates in a very strange way to the Great Pyramid of Giza. And the theory goes, if you take a calendar of 6,000 years and you make 1 inch equal 1 year, and you lay this calendar starting outside the door of the Great Pyramid, going up the angle of the passageways, all the way into the King's Chamber, that's 6,000 years. And you can find in the architecture of the pyramid certain points that are marked off which clearly delineate elements of history which happened at that correct time. So the whole thing is like a lovely clothesline upon which you can hang all the events of history that are supposedly adding up to this one apocalyptic event around the year 2000. Now, there's a specific day in the year 2000, May 5th, 2000. In fact, there was another hijacker-to-be of the conspiracy-minded who tried to cash in on that. On May 5th of the year 2000, all the planets perceptible from the Earth, which means Venus, Mars, the Sun and Moon, which are perceived as planets in the ancient system, Jupiter and Saturn and Mercury, all of them are perceptible in a line across space, and this galactic alignment, which is predicted by the astronomy of the day, happens on May 5th, and on that day, so the Solar Temple believed, that was when the world was going to end. And there are people who actually have made, one guy, Richard Noon's his name, wrote a best-selling book called 5/5/2000 of how the Freemasons knew that the end of the world is going to happen on May 5th. And there's going to be tidal waves, they're going to wash everybody away. Of course, it didn't happen, but he made a pretty hefty price selling his book during the 90s, when people were very afraid. So, the calendar of light, which we use, does isomorphically, which is a fancy word for saying that one thing is like the other, it does link up and seem to explain human history if you lay it alongside the timeline of the Great Pyramid. But no one knows why that is, and nobody really knows what the purpose is. And if you look at the deep mysteries of symbolic history in Freemasonry, you keep coming up against this problem. Nobody knows where it comes from. Nobody knows why we have certain things and why we don't. And I've looked, brethren, I've looked very deeply into the fine details of history. Why do we have the calendar? Why do we have the Holy Saints John in our lodges? Why do we have the mythology of the vault? This is the key that is currently being exploited by the likes of the Da Vinci Code, etc. What is the vault in Solomon's temple, right? Now, here again, most Freemasons are shockingly ignorant of our own mythology. First of all, the vault that King Solomon has under what is now the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. That's not even the real vault. See, there's a very, very subtle, I know it's very complex, brethren, please bear with me. There's a very subtle exploitation of ambiguity that goes on with these conspiracy theories, where they say, well, there's certain things that all are going to boil down to what did King Solomon have in his vault, who found it, and what are they doing with it today, okay? So, for example, the guys back in the Da Vinci Code theory, they want to tell you that in the vault of King Solomon was the secret scrolls of Jesus that are going to prove X, Y, and Z about why you should buy our next book. Okay? Or they're going to tell you, oh, in the vault was the secret bloodline that proves that this French fop should be king of Europe. No, no. It's not what was in the vault. You know how I know? Because our own mythology tells us that whatever was in the vault cannot be earlier. It cannot be later in time than the ancient Egyptians. It has to be something that King Solomon found when he was building the first temple. It's not something that he just put in the temple. It has to be something he found from elsewhere. Why? Because our own mythology tells us that when Solomon was building the first vault, the first temple, he stumbled across another vault on the site. And this vault is the vault of Enoch. Okay? Enoch is the most important figure in Freemasonic mythic history. He's more important than Solomon. He's more important than Hiram Abiff. Why? Because he is the one who gives it all away. He's the one who is the master architect in the mythology going back to the pre-flood era. Okay? Now this is where a lot of the conspiracy theories love to insert the Atlantis mythology into the Freemasonry. And that sounds laughable at first, but actually, the more you analyze it, the less laughable it becomes. But sticking just with Enoch for the moment, okay? Enoch's vault was found by Solomon's workers. And whatever they found inside of it, that formed the basis for King Solomon's understanding of God, all of his mystical powers. This is according to our mytho-history. Okay? Now, if Enoch, who, by the way, in Masonic and Arabic history, is claimed to be the one who built the Great Pyramid. Okay? If Enoch is the guy who left behind all of the secrets of Freemasonry in a vault found by Solomon, and then Solomon, based on this, becomes the, patron of the first temple, etc. What we got to look at here is we're not in real history. We're in a mythic history. And everything that's going on, it breaks down according to a code. And there are certain characters in the code that mean certain things. And the problem is that in the world of Masonic conspiracies, the conspiracy theorist often knows much more about the code than any Freemason you're probably going to meet at a meeting. Why? Because we're asleep at the wheel. I hate to be even a little disrespectful, but it really bothers me because we are weaponless in the middle of a war, and it's by our own laziness. Because the whole reason that Freemasons generally have been the victims of conspiracy theories in recent years is because we don't even know how to respond to the accusations thrown out by conspiracy theorists. And the reason is not necessarily that the conspiracy theorist is some whacked out nut who's just been on the internet too long. The reason could be that we as Masons don't know enough about our history. We don't want to admit that we don't know. And so we would rather, like Aesop's fable of the sour grapes and the fox, we'd rather say, no, the grapes are sour, there's no secrets, but that's only because we can't jump high enough to get them. We haven't done the work to know what those secrets might be. And that's our fault. It's not the fault of the conspiracy theorist. And so, the thing is that we are in the position now, remember, John of the Apocalypse, we're in the position now where we have to step up to the plate. Because Freemasonry is being defined all around us. Now, I know that many people in Freemasonry couldn't care less about any of these subjects. They want to show up at the meeting, have a wonderful charity event, help out the community, and that's great. That is what Freemasonry does today. However, that is not what Freemasonry is. The charity work and everything that we see today being done by Freemasons largely was started in response to attacks that Freemasonry was getting in the early 1800s because it was too powerful, because we were everywhere. The Morgan affair occurs, etc. And so Freemasonry begins to change its public face towards the end of the 1800s and then becomes the worldwide charitable organization. But in general, if you look at the way Freemasonry is viewed, people don't care that we give away $1 million a day to charity, because they're convinced they know our secrets, and it has nothing to do with charity work. Okay, so we got to look very calmly at these type of things, and we got to understand how the conspiracies unfold, and we have to know why they're occurring now. Okay? Now, let's leave aside Enoch and the vault. I'll get back to that. The thing that we have to be most concerned with immediately when confronting the conspiracy theories today is the phenomenon known as the Illuminati. Who are the Illuminati, you ask? Well, on May 1st, 1776, an ex-Jesuit professor of canon law at the Ingolstadt University by the name of Adam Weishaupt decided that the Enlightenment values all around him that Freemasonry was pushing at the time were so revolutionary that he was going to do something even more revolutionary to promote its goals. So he infiltrates Freemasonry, quickly rises to the top. Within a few years, he has access to anybody who's anybody in Freemasonry. So what does he decide to do? He concocts a master plan where he's going to assassinate every crowned head of Europe plus the Pope. And he's going to do it all in one night of terror that's going to be organized to shock Europe away from all of its problems and ills and totally transform the world. Okay? And he got pretty close to doing it. Over a 10-year period, he had 4,000 guys in his organization, the Illuminati, all of them called from top-level Freemasons. He had 500 ready to die at his command soldiers in a holy war who were going to execute this plan. He had them in position. He had a man inside the Vatican who was bringing the Pope his lunch on a daily basis. And he was ready to go. But what happened? On a cold, stormy night in 1884, when he's organized the big meeting where everybody's going to come together to get the final orders to execute the day of terror and the night of terror, his lieutenant is riding furiously through the Bavarian woods to make the meeting. Bang! He's struck dead by lightning. The local constable finds him. The guy's stupid enough to have a list on him of all the targets that they were going to hit. All the crowned heads. Oh, what's this, the police discovered? They get back to his apartment shortly after that. They find the whole massive wall chart with everything that's going to happen, all planned out and ready to go. Conspiracies foiled. Weishaupt and his cronies have to flee to France with the King of Germany, princes of Germany, sending the shock troops after them. So the conspiracy's foiled, but by an act of God, not by an act of man. Because the people in Europe who were at the top of Freemasonry, something about those guys in Europe, they're just asleep at the wheel to the extent that, almost their entire power structure is within jeopardy of being taken out. And nobody even knew about it until it was almost over. And similar thing happened with the Solar Temple 200 years later. What a coincidence. Now, after Weishaupt and his plans are foiled, he runs to France. And like I said, they had taken over many Freemasonry lodges at the time. And in France, amongst his confederates, he decides, well, I'm not going to go for this big centralized scheme. I'm not going to boil it all down to a wall chart that some cop can find and bust it. So what does he do? Under the pen name Spartacus, the leader of the slave revolt, he starts dropping these leaflets around Paris, right? So a peasant walking through the, terrible, decrepit streets of Paris picks up a pamphlet and it says, "Why let your master beat you? Why not just kill him?" Stuff like that. "Why should the king rule you? Why not just kill him?" Just little pieces of paper, signed Spartacus. It's Adam Weishaupt and his tomfoolery goons spreading the word. Well, within a couple of years, guess what happens? The people rise up in the streets and start killing. Okay? And so, again, how did it happen? Well, all the mad crowds and all the oppression of the aristocracy, etc. Oh, these are all the canned historical answers you get about the French Revolution. No, the reason it happened is because people in Freemasonry at the time just let the Illuminati do whatever they wanted. Oh, those crazy Illuminati guys, they can do whatever they want. Oh, next thing you know, you got rivers of blood through the streets of Paris. Okay? So now, these are historical events that when people want to criticize Freemasonry, they have something in their arsenal. Okay? Now, of course, Weishaupt and the Illuminati do not speak for Freemasonry. But you know what? Nobody speaks for Freemasonry. That's the problem. There's nobody presenting the official story because the official story does not exist. Therefore, any charismatic, well-informed, symbolically hip prankster can hijack vast segments of Freemasonry and it can run out of control to the point where you have billionaires burning themselves to death or you have peasants rising up in the streets. Either way, the people who are really responsible are the members of the top Freemasonry communities who let it happen through inaction. Ella Wilcox said, "All that is required for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing." Well, in Freemasonry, we seem to know a lot about doing nothing, because a lot of evil men have tried to take over, and they've come pretty close to succeeding. Okay? Now, what we have to look at here, though, is that men are not in control. No matter how successful, and this, again, is why I believe that bolt of lightning rang out of the Bavarian sky in 1884, because men are not in control. However, Freemasonry is guided and guarded by powerful forces. Let's just refer to it as the G. Something is organizing history. Something is reaching out, like the ancient Egyptians had, the all-seeing eye above the pyramid, and the hands are on the edge of the rays coming from the eye, and those hands are puppeteering everything that happens in the world. Okay? You can look at it just as divine providence, as the founding fathers did. Okay? And the reason that everything's happening according to this master plan is because our planet itself is alive. It is a conscious being. And it's no more mysterious for vast historical events to be controlled by some unseeable force on a world history plane. That's no more mysterious than your life a year ago making sense because you're making decisions today. Okay? The ghost in the machine of you is imperceptible at that smaller level, just as the ghost in the machine of the G, God puppeteering everything. And I hate to even use that word God so flippantly. It's the divine providence, because it could be a goddess. It could be an impersonal force beyond our concepts of gender. We can't be prejudicial and too pro-Christian in our approach, because that's one of the main lessons that Freemasonry is always haunting us with. That the G is impersonal. Geometry is in fact the best way to define it, because it sidesteps these mask issues. No matter what your religious mask is, the mask does not contain all, it only represents all. But that's philosophical. But my point about what's going on during this Illuminati period is it begins to drive events in a way that no one could have predicted. Okay? Because as a result of the French Revolution, Freemasonry becomes, in a strange schizophrenic way, in charge of France. Okay? Competing factions, driven by different wings of Freemasonry, are puppeteering their different players in the mass chaos that was the French revolutionary government, or governments, I should say. During a 2-year period, they had 36 different governments. So, you know. The point is that the chaos eventually produces a small group of very powerful and controlling men, all Freemasons, led by Robespierre, and they take over and they begin to get order at the cost of even more blood through the so-called Reign of Terror. So Robespierre is trying to figure out, you know, what are we going to do with this madness that's been unleashed? And the crowds are literally banging down his door, okay? So he says to a room full of guys, look, I don't care what you have to do, just get these crowds away from my door. So one of the guys pops up and says, I've got the answer. I'll wheel out a cannon and I'll shoot him down. Who's that guy? Napoleon Bonaparte. Gets the attention of Robespierre. Next thing you know, he's his right-hand man. Next thing you know, he's getting initiated into Freemasonry. And you know what happens next? The next year, following Napoleon's being raised to the 3rd degree, he gets control of the French army. He's sent on a mission to Egypt. Okay? Now, I don't know how closely you've studied Napoleon's life, but it's pretty fascinating. And there was no strategic reason for him to go to Egypt in his big plan to be the man conquering Europe, because he loses it almost as fast as he gains it. But along with Napoleon's invasion force going to Egypt, there's a group of about 30 to 40 top Freemasonry academic scholars from Europe. And what are they going to do? While Napoleon is out waving his big sword around battling the Mamelukes, they're going through the tombs of Egypt. They're going through the ruins of the Library of Alexandria. And these Freemasonry scholars are going to kick off a worldwide renaissance of interest in the ancient world. And one of these guys, who's with Napoleon on this mission, when asked by Napoleon, what is it that the Brotherhood's looking for in Egypt? Why are you here? The answer is, for the future. And what future is that, Napoleon asks. And the response is, the apocalypse. Okay? So, regardless of what you may or may not believe, and I'm, believe me, not trying to push beliefs on anyone, that's the last thing I want to do. The fact is that these people believed it. That people like Napoleon, Weishaupt, guys like George Washington, all these types of guys who are driven by Freemasonry's master plan and what they perceive to be the providential forces, they are acting in response to the Holy Saints John. John of the Apocalypse is there, warning them of the timetable. John the Baptist is there, kicking them in the butt and saying, do something about it. And so they're doing something about it. And the guy who, ironically, and this is again one of those things about Freemasonry that falls right through the cracks, most people never think about it. The guy who figured out what Freemasonry's master plan is really about, before anybody else, Joseph Smith, the prophet of Mormonism. Okay? Why? Because he, growing up in the first 2 decades of the 1800s, when Freemasonry was at its peak, before the Morgan Affair, before the anti-Masonic Party, growing up in an environment of, you know, religious fervor, apocalyptic fervor. John of the Apocalypse, never more prominent in the minds of people than in the early part of the 1800s. Smith comes to consciousness during this era, and he's surrounded by Freemasonry. His father, 2 of his brothers, his uncle, all their friends, all big Freemasons. And Smith latches on very early to what? Enoch. The legend of Enoch. What is the legend of Enoch again? Oh, the workmen of Solomon's temple dig up, mysterious cave vault, and in it is the secrets of the master plan. So Smith says, aha! What is this master plan? Obviously no one around currently has a clue about it, because otherwise it would be happening. They're still waiting for it. And so he